In this Warmaster video, I shall review a recent tournament hosted by myself and Steve. This consisted of 3 games of Warmaster played in a single day, the 11th of May. This is the 4th time we have hosted our tournament in the city of Worcester in England. As Worcester is centrally located within the UK, this year we were able to attract 28 participants. Worcester is a typical cathedral city common in the UK and is the resting place of King John. The tournament was held at premises owned by our friendly local gaming store, Worcester War Games. And our venue is a mock Tudor building with a large gaming hall and modern facilities. Once again, the tournament was sponsored by Cromarty Forge, who provided all the prize support for contestants. With the sun shining down on us, our contestants arrived and took their places at the designated gaming tables. This year, a number of contestants brought their own table layouts and terrain, which gave us access to some very high quality gaming tables. The prize trophies were created specifically for this tournament by Worcester War Games. And this included a beautiful hand-painted wooden spoon award for the person who achieved last place. And of course it wouldn't be War-Master without the obligatory bottle of Worcestershire sauce. For this tournament there were also spot prizes every time a player lost their general. As we would be once again using the tournament rule, the king is dead, long live the king, so players did not have to fear the loss of their general if they wanted to throw him into combat. This year saw a nice spread of armies, with dark elves, demons and vampires being the most common picks. Notable by their absence were no Empire, no Bretonnians, no High Elves and no Chaos. Meanwhile, the Beastmen and Kislev players would be trying out their army's new rules this year. In the first round, opponents were determined randomly, whilst avoiding any regular opponents from being paired together. At the start of the round, each player would take 3 strategy cards, which are a regular feature at our tournaments. The cards can be played at any point during that round, and will have a minor effect on terrain, on a character or on a combat. The first round match is the scenario called Hold the Ground, where armies will be competing to capture objectives hidden deep within terrain features. And this scenario naturally favours infantry-based armies. Once all the players had set up and were ready to begin, battle commenced. Now this year, as Steve had been kind enough to volunteer to do all the tournament admin, and we had an odd number of competitors on the day, I got to play as the spare player with my Dogs of War. The list was identical to that I played against the Lizardmen in the last battle report, as this army was still packed in its case. In round 1 I was up against Adam Simmons and his beautifully painted Orc army. His was a tough army, featuring lots of heavy infantry and powerful boar boy cavalry. The bulk of his troops deployed in the centre, with one brigade of boar boys holding the right flank. I went first and advanced to grab objectives wherever I could. The artillery secured one objective for me on Brokeback Mountain. Meanwhile, the Orc infantry mobs eyed up an easy objective in the fields ahead of them. I used a strategy card on the Orc hero mounted on the Wyvern, and whilst it had no effect on the game, it did cause Adam to fail his command test as he was too busy laughing. The Dogs of War units continued their general advance up the field in my second turn, securing the objective in the middle of the board, while my wizards excelled themselves in crippling the Orc cavalry with their spells. Unfortunately, my own heavy infantry failed to make it into the field to snatch the objective in front of the Orcs, whilst the Dwarven Gatehouse objective remained uncontested by both sides. Orc turn 2 saw a big cavalry clash right in the centre of the board, whilst the Orc infantry secured their objective in the field. The boar boys charge home against the light cavalry, who stand and shoot. And whilst the orcs are victorious, they fail to kill off either unit. In my turn, I launch a counter-charge into the orc boar boys with my knights, whilst my heavy infantry brigade engages the orcs in the field. Even the pikemen join in this turn, with 3 units moving into combat. The battle for the field is brutal and bloody, but the orcs are forced to retreat from the attacking ogres. The knights destroy the boar boys, including their wyvern character, and then advance into nearby wolf chariots. When the dust settles, the dogs of war are clearly in control of 3 objectives, whilst the battle in the fields continues. Adam then responds by sending 1 unit of boar boys off to capture the objective by the gates. And with the majority of the greenskin army now engaged in combat, the only decisive movement from the orcs is a brigade of 3 boar boys which thunder into an unfortunate unit of pike. The boar boys then advance into the flank of the ogres and marauders, swinging this fight firmly in the favour of the orcs, allowing them to push the enemy out of the fields and recapture the objective. At the end of the game, both sides have racked up an impressive tally of victory points, but with 3 objectives held to 2, it's the dogs of war that can claim victory. At the end of the first round, each player hands in their victory point total, and this determines the placings ready for round 2. Already there has been a strong performance from the Vampire Count's armies, although it's a Dark Elf force which can claim top spot. The second round pairings are now based upon players' victory point scores, and I find myself paired up against the dreaded Dark Elves. Round 2 will be Spoils of War, where 5 objective markers are placed across the centre line of the board, and these objectives can be picked up and moved by units. Captured loot tokens are worth bonus victory points, and this scenario favours cavalry-based armies. Unfortunately, during round 2 I didn't have time to take many photos, so I will leave you with some pictures taken by Thomas Webster Deakin of his gorgeous demon army engaged with the Wood Elves. In my game against Simon Coldrick's Dark Elves, I set up my force in a long line, intending to move forward and snatch the 3 objectives in the open ground. Unfortunately, a failure of command stymied my advance, with the infantry ending up in a somewhat disorganised blob in the centre. Simon responded with a patient chess player's move, with 1 heavy cavalry brigade edging up the left flank to threaten 2 objectives. Undeterred, my light cavalry were able to dart forwards, snatch an objective and retreat from under the noses of the Cold Ones. In the centre, my infantry redressed their lines and began to advance once more, under a hail of crossbow fire. Simon then responded decisively, whilst 1 unit of Cold Ones held back to capture an objective, 2 units were sent forward to smash into my light cavalry. The horse archers did inflict some light damage with their stand and shoots, but once the Manticore hero joined the combat, things were looking bleak for the humans. Thankfully, a unit of crossbowmen were also contacted by the Cold One charge, so they lend their missile shots and support to the combat. Despite this, in the combat phase, the light cavalry are wiped out and their loot is captured by the Cold One knights. Elsewhere, the Dark Elf infantry have no problem in jumping forwards and capturing some loot of their own before retreating to a nearby farmhouse. The repeater crossbow fire then sows heavy confusion amongst my lines. In my next turn, I respond with a counter-charge of my knights into the Cold One knights, and my terror-causing hero joins the fray to counter the Manticore. This is sufficient for me to win the combat and recapture the stolen loot. However, Simon counteracts this with another Cold One charge, this time into crossbowmen and the flanks of my ogres. The Cold Ones make short work of my infantry, although 1 unit decides to stay locked in combat against the ogres. I fare better on my right flank, as in later turns I finish off the Cold Ones occupying that portion of the board and take all the loot that was previously held by them. This is mainly due to my inability to roll less than 4+ for hitting and taking saves. The terror-causing hero then joins a unit of pike, who manage to flank charge the remaining Cold Ones in the centre and clean them up. In response, the Dark Elves secure 2 of the 5 possible loot tokens, and then, as an act of spite, wipe out one of my units through repeater crossbow fire. When the game ends, I've secured 3 loot counters to the Dark Elves 2, and racked up an impressive victory point tally by wiping out 5 units of Cold One Knights plus their Manticore, although Simon's Dark Elves also performed well and secured a decent victory point score. At the end of round 2, each player's victory point total was added to their score from round 1, which gave us a new ranking. I was surprised to find myself in 5th place, with the 3 Vampire Counts players above me, while the top spot occupied by Paul Winter's Orcs and Goblins. In round 3, opponents were once more allocated based on players' relative scores, and I found myself up against Grey Maynard's Vampires. Round 3 was a straight up battle, the only scenario condition being that any units that were killed by the addition of your general in the combat scored double victory points. This gave players the opportunity to vastly increase their victory point total through tactical play. So returning to my third game, I was pleased to see that my army would be taking on the undead in true Dark Omen style. Unfortunately, my first couple of turns were beset with a failure of orders and my forces advanced slowly. Luckily, the undead forces matched my slow rate of advance, although their dominating right cavalry wing was a concern. Still, I took the bait and charged, with my cavalry engaging theirs. Meanwhile, my heavy infantry was hunting out the weaker undead infantry hiding in a wood. The undead suffered heavy casualties from their Black Knight and Direwolf units, but then the Vampire Lord joined combat for the counterattack, wiping out 3 of my 4 cavalry units, and my terror-causing hero. The undead general then turned his attention to some unfortunate pikemen who went the same way as the cavalry. However, I stuck to my plan and the ogres and marauders eventually made it into the wood to engage the undead infantry, which they crushed in short order. This caused sufficient damage to break the Vampire Count's army, but as the majority of their troops were so cheap, it didn't net me very many victory points. Graham, meanwhile, by focusing on the rules of the scenario, earned himself quite a high score. At the end of round 3, the scores for each player were added to their running total, with some players achieving extremely high victory point scores, clearly by throwing their generals into every combat. Steve then totted up the victory point totals to get the final results. And in a surprise result, Alex Janaway moved up from 6th place to claim the top spot and victory for Kislev. Once all victory point totals were rounded up to the nearest 5 points, it transpired that Alex had scored the same total as Vincent Lodi. However, as Alex had beaten Vincent by 90 points in their final game together, this was sufficient to claim top spot. Vincent's vampires took 2nd place, whilst Mark Simpkins' vampires took 3rd. Other prizes were awarded to Neil Slay as most sporting opponent, Gaz Taylor for most generals killed in combat, and Austin Farm for best themed army. And every player received a free gift from Community Forge simply for attending. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our contenders for helping to make Warmaster 4 the success that it was. It was clear throughout the tournament that this was a group of veteran gamers who enjoy their hobby and were there to have fun. And myself and Steve hope to see you all again next year for Warmaster 5.